Battle is brewing in Western Canada. As you just heard, Premier Christy Clark wants BC to get a bigger cut from Northern Gateway revenues in exchange for provincial approval of the pipeline. But Alberta Premier Alison Redford says that's not going to happen. In fact, she says that would mean changing Confederation. So what now? Designing a national energy strategy on the agenda as premiers gather for their annual meeting in Halifax. But does this spat between BC and Alberta mean a national strategy is now dead in the water? And where does Canada's rising energy star Saskatchewan stand? Joining me now from Halifax is Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, you met with BC Premier Christy Clark last Thursday. She outlined her new strategy for allowing pipelines to go through BC. What do you make of the 5 conditions announced yesterday?
Well, 4 of the 5 are very reasonable and I think need to be a part of any major project, frankly. The 5th one is problematic. The 5th one requires that Alberta citizens, because that's who owns the resource in this case, share some of their royalties with BC before it can offer its approval. I don't think anyone would disagree that the people of British Columbia deserve more than just assurances. They deserve to mitigate the environmental risks mitigated. Number one. Number two, I think it's reasonable to expect, given the risks that BC people would be taking in this pipeline, potentially, that there'd be some benefit. I think the source for these things needs to be the companies, though. It needs to be the pipeline company itself, perhaps, or the oil companies on the other side. I think the condition on royalties is problematic because of the precedent it sets. BC has said, look, this is just specific to bitumen, but you know, 20% of the world's uranium is produced in Saskatchewan, and we don't have any nuclear power plants there. We don't have any refining capacity in Saskatchewan, so it's exported all around the world and outside of our provincial borders. We export a lot of the world's potash. 30 to 35% of the world's potash used in any given year can come from Saskatchewan. There's agricultural products as well, and so this is the thin edge of a very big wedge that I think is not helpful when we are trying as a country to continue what I think is the Canadian advantage, the relative economic strength we have, in being able to provide what a world that wants energy security and food security needs. And so we're worried very much about the precedent, and we would support, notionally support the position that Alberta has put forward in response to the condition.
Yeah, so Alberta Premier Alison Redford had some pretty tough words for Clark. What do you make of her position, essentially not being open to negotiating with BC?
Well, again, I'm not sure it should be the people of Alberta that British Columbia would want to focus on in terms of trying to get their share. The resources in any province, including the natural resources of British Columbia, belong to the people of those respective provinces. That's the case that Saskatchewan tried to make during the potash takeover, and one that's, I think, is supported by politicians of every stripe. And that's why I think the companies in this case may be well asked to provide a greater benefit, may be well asked to ensure that environmental risks are mitigated to a greater extent than they already are. But not necessarily the people of Alberta or the people of Saskatchewan whose royalty this is.
So you don't really see this as Redford's national energy strategy really being an Alberta energy strategy with the rest of the country simply having to sign on?
Well, no. I think, well, first of all, the energy strategy per se that we'll talk about here in Halifax has to be about transmission, has to be about exports. It also has to be about branding. And I hope the entire country can be proud of the oil and natural gas assets that we have and the uranium that we have, as well as the renewable sources of energy. We are an energy power, and unlike most energy powers in the world, we're spending more per capita from a public standpoint, and companies are spending more to mitigate against environmental risk, to invest in sustainability, to reduce the carbon footprint. We need to do more, but I think we're doing it more effectively than most other energy powers in the world, and I hope the country can be proud of this resource. It's not just Alberta's, it's the country's. We're the second largest producer of conventional oil, and there are natural gas opportunities across Canada. So, you know, I think the energy strategy does go, though, to the transmission and the export issue, and now we have an additional part of that debate, I guess, in the wake of the announcement yesterday from British Columbia. Yeah,
with all this back and forth, do you think it's going to be possible for the premiers to have an agreement on a national energy strategy?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I think that this does change things, this proposal from British Columbia, these conditions they've put on it. But it goes beyond energy. Again, you can't just say, look, we only want to do this in the case of bitumen. What about the rail transport of other minerals or perhaps dangerous chemicals that are manufactured in, potentially dangerous chemicals that are manufactured in other parts of Canada and shipped across? You know, there are many provinces that are landlocked. Saskatchewan's one of them. We have no prospects of a port anytime soon in Saskatchewan. So we rely on this export opportunity. And if we can export, then we can contribute as a have province to the country. And really the country can benefit. That's true of any provincial economy when it's able to thrive. And so transportation with respect to exports is essential. And now we have an interest, I think a troubling precedent that's being set.
Now, I want to move on to another topic. Yesterday, we learned that Chinese-controlled oil company Sinopec wants to buy Canadian oil and gas firm Nexen. So how much foreign investment in Canada's energy sector is too much?
Well, I think the important metric here is one that's already prescribed in the Investment Canada process, and one, by the way, that we leaned heavily on in our own analysis of the potash takeover, and that is those are the words net benefit. That's a pretty liberating, although general, but it's a pretty liberating measure for any of these deals. In fact, we applied it in the case of the potash takeover. We tried to apply it in our own analysis of the recent Viterra takeover by Glencore, and they had different results, but it was helpful. And I think it's up to the companies, both the takeover proponent and the company that's being taken over potentially, to demonstrate to the country and to Investment Canada, to the federal government, and therefore to Canadians, that there's a benefit here. I think we want to be measured and circumspect with respect to this particular takeover and others. It's good to have Canadian champions in the resource sector. And so I think there really has to be a net benefit demonstrated before something like this is approved. I don't know the details of the takeover, and so I don't feel comfortable commenting beyond that. But we do have the net benefit measure that's, I think, helpful in this regard, and I'm sure will be applied.
Now, looking ahead to the Premier's conference starting tomorrow, you and PEI Premier Robert Giz will be introducing the Healthcare Innovation Report. Can you give us a preview of that?
No.
All right, thank you.
I don't want to scoop the report. It's going to be out in just a couple of days here. But I can say, look, there's three categories we focused on that we have shared publicly before, and we've actually added a couple that are new. But they are scope of practice, models of team care across the country that are bearing results, especially in rural and remote areas, that can be replicated. We're going to recommend that they be implemented by the provinces, not talked about, but implemented, because we've done the homework. Also, clinical practice guidelines. We've identified two chronic diseases, and then clinical practice guidelines that have been proven and tested, that are working to provide better care more effectively, with more value, more efficiently in terms of the overall cost. We'll be able to offer those. On health and human resources, we've laid out some recommendations where provinces can cooperate a little bit. 76% of the costs of our healthcare system in Saskatchewan are human resources. They're crucial to the system. We value them, but we need as provinces to perhaps coordinate to make sure that they're sustainable in the long term. And then there's a couple more that we'll talk about, and that's lean, the lean techniques in healthcare, those management techniques that are bearing real fruit for us in Saskatchewan, and generic drugs. We think we can do a lot better by working together in achieving savings on generic drugs, and we'll have a very specific recommendation on that. So I guess it wasn't no after all. That's a bit of a preview, but I shouldn't go further than that, or Premier Giz he'll be on my cell. He'll be calling my cell next.
And what are you going to do to get the feds on side, just quickly?
These recommendations don't require the federal government involvement. We hope they do what we're doing in terms of their areas of responsibility on First Nation reserves and with the armed forces, for example, where they have a responsibility to deliver health care. These recommendations will work for them too. If they want to do that, that's fine, but we do not require them to move ahead. That's part of what the premiers wanted to achieve with this. Let's move forward with healthcare innovation at a sustainable cost.
Premier Brad Wall, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Hannah.